Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, The Divine Council, Part 3. Welcome back to Part 3 in our series on the Divine Council as we're trying to explore the idea of the word Elohim as it relates to the usage in the Hebrew Bible by utilizing the context of the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds of neighboring nations and languages to help us better understand this concept, rather than using our theology that is only a few centuries old. In this episode, we want to explore the idea of human understanding of government and power sharing that has gone forth from ancient of days until today, until ancient times. In the ancient world, they understood the human government system to be based upon the divine right given by the gods, and as human rulers were interacting appropriately with divine beings, they were endowed with the power and the blessing of the gods to rule. And differing kingdoms would be able to claim such right of rule by the blessing of their god beyond the other gods, who were often offended by their people in some sense, and that's why they were not blessing their own people. And that would explain the exchange and debate of how a nation would lose the battle. A nation would lose favor with their God, and their God would withdraw from the battle. And then the victorious nation would receive their own God's blessing and become the present superpower. But not much has changed in the ideas of human power sharing through the centuries when one just takes a broad survey. And we want to look at systems today like the office of a prime minister among his ministers, who is elected by the members of parliament, who are elected by their own citizenry, to reflect how power sharing occurs today and how a vote of confidence can change everything, or a swing in the majority as factions realign themselves to create a new form of government that's often seen whether in the UK or Israel or nations like Nepal, to understand how these rulers are geographically connected to portions of their populace and their people, obviously the land itself and their districts they represent. Then that is a part of the power sharing, and that not much has changed from the ancient world in that sense. And so there's a lot of commonality. And when we're viewing how governance took place in the ancient world, and then they're mapping that cosmologically onto the world of the supernatural and understanding the divine rule in that sense. And this is a common motif across the cultures of the ancient Near East. Then we begin to understand how the idea of a divine council is not so foreign to them. It's only foreign to us in a post-enlightened world of the monotheist who has deleted all the gods. And so let's explore a little bit of that today. It's very convoluted, and it's very hard for some people outside to understand how it works. Much the same way, it's hard for a reader to understand the divine counsel in one's Bible if one is not familiar with these concepts. And so it can become a way into understanding a different form of governance, and then that allows a different reading of the Bible. And then once one actually gains that understanding of how a foreign entity, how its powers are designed, and the language and usage and the commonality between our own system and their system, then we can begin to see how we can do the same with ancient concepts and understanding how they understood things. And then it will help us better read the text to understand the message that God was revealing to that people at that time, and how we can make it applicable to our time. Perhaps maybe a modern way to look at this would be modern governments based upon the evolution of the idea from the beginning. And so you have to look outside of a scenario like the United States, where in the United States you have a president, a vice president. In other parts of the world, we have something called a prime minister. And this concept is very important to understanding the idea here. In a setting where you have a prime minister, the people per se, like in the country of Nepal, people of Nepal elect members of parliament. So the prime minister is chosen by the parliament, and the parliament, members of parliament, are elected by the people. But the people do not choose their own prime minister. They choose members of parliament on the election, and then members of parliament have to then work together to choose who is going to be the prime minister. And then the prime minister forms the government, trying to form his cabinet ministers from a coalition of compromise in power sharing among other members of different parties who form the majority government. In the United States, you have typically, although it's becoming more fractured, but typically you have two parties, the left party and the right party. But in a country like Nepal, you have multiple parties, innumerable parties. And what you do is the people will elect members of parliament. And those members of parliament then represent the people geographically across the entire nation. And together they must work with the chosen prime minister whom they choose. And then that prime minister works with them to choose who's going to fill each cabinet position. So members of parliament, in a sense, rule or represent the people from different geographical areas. And then they choose specific person to head or form the majority government, who then, along with them, work out a compromise to fill cabinet positions that each cabinet member is going to hold authority over different various aspects of government. And they're going to be in control of those aspects. And the members of parliament must maintain their election status within their party and within their geographical locations in order to continue to rule, either as the prime minister or a lower level cabinet member, who then will then appoint within each of their cabinet positions members of government who will have authority over lower levels within that position. And those parties come together, those ministers come together to form a government, and they form the majority government by stringing together this confederation or this coalition of numerous parties. And so that's the kind of the idea you have. So recently, Nepal has faced very much difficulty, and this is one of the things that's going to happen to cause Nepal to move into a new tier by the United Nations. For them to, if they can get their government stabilized, then they can move into the next level of becoming a developing nation, if they can get their governance corrected. And so their governance has to become stable. And so they have gone through forming a constitution. They've gone through, and they had their first major stable government with their last prime minister, but then things did not go well. A vote of confidence was held against the ruling party, and that prime minister was then eventually sacked, even though he did much to try to avoid his sacking. He finally was deposed, in a sense, and a new prime minister was installed, but then it took quite some time for that new prime minister to get his cabinet together, to get things together, because there was so much change in the political situation, based upon whether or not the current status quo was actually faithful to doing what they should for what was best for the people, best for the country and those who were elected by the people. And so there are a vast majority of the people that support the old prime minister, and there's a much greater, it seems like, majority that support the new prime minister. And they have had so many prime ministers in the past, and it keeps changing. And so they're looking for stable governance. Israel has similar system. The UK has a similar system. Even Germany has similar system of the changing. At any time, a vote of confidence can be made, and changing of the powers. And so you have this idea, and even in, previously in this part of the world, in Nepal, previously you had many kings, and then one king is eventually lording it over all the other kings. Even in India, before the British rule, you had many, many leaders, many kings, and each of those kings had their dominance, but one king comes together to rule them all. And in the ancient world, you had similar setup. In the ancient world, with the rise of the city and the rise of city-states, you have different kings holding different power over different portions in kind of like geography. So you have cosmic geography. You have geography where there is a king that is associated as ruling over a certain population. And that king has power over that population. Yet he may end up being a vassal to another king who is more powerful. And he ends up paying taxes. And you see that in the Bible, where at times, David establishes his rule, and Solomon, definitely his rule, where the Queen of Sheba is coming all the way from Africa to pay homage to Solomon. And you have this idea of the rule of a king and charging taxes over all these other nations who pay tribute to them. These nation states, these city states, these kings, from other nations that are vassal underneath David or a vassal underneath Solomon, where they could, have this position. But then later on, it devolves, and you have, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, and most of the time, they're ended up being vassals underneath other leaders. And so where during the time of David or Solomon, Edom paid tribute to David and Solomon, and many other kings did. Eventually, though, that devolves, and the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom, they are paying homage and tribute to other kings, for the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and you have Egypt even in the mix here. And so there was a time when Egypt ruled, and Moses was there, but then that time ceases to be, and Egypt is not this great power anymore. And in Egypt, the king, the Pharaoh, was considered, his house was considered the dynasty, the power over, representing God on earth, representing, as a son of God. And this language is very much in view in the Greek understanding, as Caesar, when he is assassinated, that's a political nightmare. And so he is elevated politically before the people. He's elevated so that they can maintain this peace, this rule of law. He's elevated as becoming God. Julius Caesar becomes a god, and they turn his assassination into his becoming God. And Caesar is as son of God, and eventually the Greeks then begin the Romans begin then to implement this system of thought where whoever the head son is, he takes over, and he becomes not only son of God, eventually he becomes God, and the city-states start building temples, not to the old Greek gods, but building temples to the Caesars and worshiping the Caesars. And so you have the Caesar worship, where Caesar becomes God on the earth, which was not possible previously. And so it's an evolutionary thought where the Caesar becomes God, incarnate God on the earth. But the Egyptians already had this idea that the king represented God in some sense. And we'll get into this later, but this whole idea of, the king representing the divine incarnation, this all is going to be unraveled, is going to show, and even later on the Europeans and this divine right of kings, and how Charlemagne and all this devolves into how, the kings are God and God incarnate and representation of God, and the Holy Roman Empire, and how Rome and the Pope, and how that's God and that's the kingdom of God on the earth, and yet the kings and the popes are only trying to parse what was done in the past when the king and the prophets, tried to parse, prophet, priest, and king, and trying to understand all of that, which, has to be all, parsed out and understood, how we understand God's rule upon the earth and how he rules. Well, it's a reflection in those chosen to rule over those who are priests and prophets over the religion, but speaking against the falseness of corrupt beings, as prophets speak against the corrupt rulers who do not represent the people, who do not represent God, because of all the unfaithfulness. And the time of Christ and the situation with the Romans, who politically rule over in the first century Judea, yet you have the temple, and yet the politics of the Pharisees and the Sadducees cause the Essenes to go out into Qumran and establish their own system, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees are in bed with the Romans, such, yet you have a king, and so it's very difficult to understand Pontius Pilate's role as a Roman procurator underneath the Caesar, and in bed with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, who have to be with the Herod's family, as that is king, and Herod is king of the Jews. And so you have all this, trying to parse this understanding. And so it's very difficult. But yet you begin to see how the politics is trying to represent that God is somehow ruling. There is a divine being somehow ruling over this section of geography, and how the ruler reflects that rule, and each power would then, represent a god, an Elohim, and their vassal to the more powerful at the time, whether it's Marduk and the Babylonians, whether it's, the Assyrians and what they're doing, or whether it's Egyptians with Pharaoh. You see all the time there are other ones that say that their God has to then kind of be below the other gods. And so you have all these rebellions of different sons rebelling against, the other gods, and taking over. And so it all gets confusing. And so what I'm trying to just say in this short segment here is that this is nothing new. If you carefully study it out, this is nothing new of how each one understood the rule of the divine council being reflected in the human rule, and how that corresponded in religion, and how that corresponded in royalty, and how that corresponded in the prophets who had to speak against both when they were wrong. How all that plays out in biblical theology is something that must be parsed out and figured out. And so we have to carefully, delicately unravel all of these mysteries. And that's what needs to be done. And that's what needs to be understood. And that's what needs to be parsed. But it's there. And it's complex. So it's not as easy as saying, what we want to say, to the more simple-minded, hey, this is where babies come from, to a 5-year-old. Well, it's all quite complex, and it all has to be unraveled, because there are times when things just don't jive and they don't mix, because you have the divine beings that are in rebellion to the divine ruler of the cosmos. For the Hebrew people, that's Yahweh. And then when you have the kings and priests being also unfaithful and in rebellion, then the prophets have to speak to that, and they have to roll back the curtain and say, hey, there's something else going on in here, because these folks are not in sync with Yahweh and the kingdom of God, the rule that you know, as the Bible states it should be, and what we're actually experiencing practically. And so, trying to map all that out, and map out who is in charge of whom, and it's all based on geography, and it goes back to understanding Yahweh, Zion theology, and the rule of the cosmos and cosmic geography that's in play. To understand what's behind all of this, it's very difficult, because people rebel, and there are many people at different times, and there's many different rebellions, and people choose to follow. And so the Bible is just depicting these rebellions hand in hand, when a divine being or divine beings are rebelling against Yahweh and against his divine counsel. And we'll get into that. We'll unravel all these things slowly as we make our way through. But the human rebellions that correspond with the divine rebellions, and how this keeps getting repeated over and over again, and this rhythm keeps happening, just like you have verse in a song, and then you have the chorus, and again verse and chorus. Well, we have this divine dance of humanity, and we have different rebellions occurring that requires God to act and intervene and bring about a restoration, a recreation, a renewal, a cosmic purification, and a cosmic restoration of back to the way things were intended. And this keeps happening over and over again prophetically, until it has to happen apocalyptically. And what we're experiencing now as the kingdom of God is in play even today, as opposed to what's coming. And it's all a reflection of what happened in the past, being repeated in patterns and rhythms, repeating themselves until we reach the final eschaton, where the final end occurs and it's all straightened out. And this is all in interplay here. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.